Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us. This is the fourth and final edition of the fall 2022 Misinformation Speaker Series, co-sponsored by Harvard and Northeastern. I'm Matt Baum. I'm the Marvin Cowell Professor of Global Communications at the Harvard Kennedy School. We will be back in the winter and spring with another set of speakers that will be sending information around fairly soon. But today we're fortunate to have Professor Jamie Druckman, who is the Payson S. Wild Professor of Political Science and a faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. His work focuses on political preference formation and communication. He examines how citizens make political, economic, and social decisions in different contexts. He also researches the relationship between citizens' preferences, public policy, and the polarization of American society. He's published more than 150 articles and book chapters in political science, communication, economics, science, and psychology journals. He's been editor of Political Psychology and Public Opinion Quarterly, as well as of the University of Chicago Press's series in American Politics. He's currently co-principal investigator of the time-sharing experiments for the social sciences and editor of the Cambridge Elements series on experimental political science. Actually, I'm just going to stop there because the list just sort of keeps on going and going. But today, Professor Druckman is going to be speaking to us on anti-democratic attitudes and support for partisan violence. Are misperceptions to blame? So for questions, please use the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of the Zoom screen, and we will take Q&A following the talk. So Jamie, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. Thanks for the very gracious introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here and for all of you to come. I know it's a very busy time of the end of fall semester, and so I really appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen, and so as Matt said, the title is Anti-Democratic Attitudes and Support for Partisan Violence Are Misperceptions to Blame. So this might be slightly different than the typical talk in the series, but hopefully as the talk goes along, you'll see why I think it's relevant to questions of misinformation and misperceptions. It's obviously in the title, so hopefully it'll come up at some point. But let me start by putting this in a broader perspective of kind of where I'm coming from in this project. And some of these ideas will disappear for a little bit when I get into some of the nuts and bolts of what I do, but then I'm going to come back to some of these larger questions at the end. And so with that in mind, I'm going to go all the way back to the founding and thinking about parties at the founding. And of course, as most people are aware, when we think about the foundings and how the Federalists talked about parties, or what they called factions, they were very worried about factions that pursue self-interest ahead of the nation's interest. And of course, there's this very famous statement from George Washington's 1796 farewell address, where he says, "A party kindles animosity of one party against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption." Kind of sounds like contemporary day politics. It's an interesting evolution then in political science, because we fast forward to modern political science in the mid-20th century, and suddenly there's a lot of concern that parties are not strong enough. So it's a very big switch. We have the famous 1950 APSA report, which Schattschneider was the lead author on. He had written in a book prior to that, "Modern Democracy is Unthinkable in Save of Parties." And then at the turn of the 21st century, this is a quote from an article, "The scholarly consensus on contemporary American political parties in the electorate centers on party decline." So we fast forward 20 years beyond that to basically today, we have yet another very different view, something that looks a lot more like the original view of the founders. So this is just a title of a science policy forum, "Political Sectarianism in America, a Poisonous Cocktail of Othering, Aversion, and Moralization Poses a Threat to Democracy." And this is just a small sampling of book titles that we've seen recently: "Why We're Polarized," "Political Tribes," "Divided We Fall," "Demography and Democracy," "Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop," and so on and so forth. And so basically, the question that I'm trying to get at is kind of not only what has happened, but what are the consequences for democratic functioning. And so where I'm going to go on the talk is I'm going to talk briefly about sorting and polarization, and I'm going to talk about how this is kind of segued into concern about anti-democratic attitudes and support for partisan violence. Then I'm going to get to the misperception part, and specifically what I've called meta-perceptions, which I assume a fair number of you are familiar with, but I'll define them quite clearly. I'll talk about a common antidote that is celebrated in a lot of work recently. I'll talk about some theory behind that in an experiment, and I'm going to kind of question whether this antidote is so great. And then, time permitting, I'm going to try to keep a watch on the clock. I might talk a little bit about this mega study that I've been involved with in some state legislator data. But either way, if I get to that or not, I'm going to end not with a conclusion, but more with just questions that I think are pressing today. I just felt like I was not in a position yet to arrive at a conclusion given some of the larger questions that I'm grappling with. And so let me start again kind of from a broader perspective, and then I'm going to narrow in. So as we all know, again, going back to the Federalists, when we think of American democracy in particular, we think about two things that help keep it stable. One is pluralism with cross-cutting cleavages across parties, and the other are political institutions with checks and balances, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we've seen over the 21st century is this massive demographic and ideological sorting of the parties. And so this is just a graph from American National Election Studies data. And so you can see in the top two lines, you see this is the percentage of Democrats and Republicans who self-identify as either liberals or conservatives. So you can see at the turn of the century in 2000, you had about 78% of Democrats self-identifying as liberals and 67% of Republicans self-identifying as conservatives. But you see, as we got to the 2020, we see nearly, when you think about people who are randomly responding, basically everybody is identifying in terms of the ideology that goes with their party. So you see this ideological sorting. We've also seen demographic sorting, and I just chose something that's simple to display without going into detail. So I just chose people who self-identify as white. I could have chosen a number of different demographic categories, race, ethnicity, religion, income, so on and so forth. So in 2000, white respondents were basically split between the parties. In 2020, you saw 53% of white respondents identify as Republicans and 37% of white respondents identify as Democrat. And of course, one of the kind of flip sides of this is if I had done this for non-white respondents, we would see the inverse proportions. And so a consequence of that is that partisanship becomes somewhat of a mega identity. That is what partisanship, generally speaking, is not a very high salience identity for people. But when it starts to envelop many other identities and groups, then it becomes something that people see as a good heuristic in terms of how they think about other people. And what happens here is we no longer have these cross-cutting cleavages, either in terms of ideology or demographic differences. And what we see is this fear that Madison expressed in Federalist 10, where elites divide mankind into parties and inflame them with mutual animosity, disposed to vex and oppress one another, right? Because there isn't that pluralism going on. And so this is probably a figure, as I explain it, which is probably familiar to a lot of you. This is just a typical measure of what is called affective polarization. And what this is just, again, from the American National Election Study data, where it just is a thermometer where it asks people to rate different groups, and in this case, the political parties, on a 0 to 100 scale, with 100 being very warm and 0 being very cold. And what we see is in the top line is what people think of their own party. So Democrats rating Democrats, for example. And we see that's pretty flat since 1976. But we see since 1976, when people rate the out party, we see this monotonic decline. So they were pretty indifferent in 1976, right about at just below 50. In 2020, in the American National Election Study, that came in at 19 degrees. And so we see this 30 percentage point drop, or 31 percentage point drop, basically, over the 21st century, where people are really coming to have a lot of dislike for the other party. Now, that's kind of generated this enormous amount of debate. And so whether this is related to other democratic outcomes is debated, and some of you might be familiar with this debate. I'm not going to get into this debate myself right here. My point is, I'm going to come back to some of the issues I raised, but for the time being, my point is that trend, along with other things such as contemporary world events or events in this country that we're all very familiar with, has led to substantial concern about democratic backsliding. And specifically, this is manifested in people talking about anti-democratic attitudes and partisan violence. And from a macro perspective, this is reflected in most international indicators of functioning democracy have downgraded the United States since 2016. So we kind of see this international perception, this domestic perception, and this rising concern about elites, but also mass support for anti-democratic attitudes and potentially partisan violence. So I'm going to focus in on that for a bit now. And so when we think about anti-democratic attitudes, those are fairly, we can think about them in lots of different ways. Generally speaking, they're violations of laws, norms, or ideals that can concern electoral fairness, constitutional practices, or civil liberties. And the concern here, or the contemporary concern, is that people privilege their party over democracy. And so that is, they privilege their party winning over democratic process. And by so doing, they undermine the legitimacy of the opposition, and they also undermine forbearance. That is, the executive in particular doesn't limit themselves to their actions, and they might overstep. So when we think about this theoretically in terms of how anti-democratic attitudes work, it can be construed as a coordination game. And this was a theory put forth by a very nice paper from 1997 by Barry Weingast. And his argument was basically that elites maintain democratic attitudes because they worry that if they don't, they're going to lose citizen support. That is, if an elite suddenly starts advocating or taking actions deemed as undemocratic, they're going to no longer have support even from partisans of their own side. So that then moves to the question of, why do citizens value democracy? And his argument there is that citizens value democracy because they worry that if they don't, that makes them vulnerable to oppression by citizens later. That is, that if they allow their leaders to be undemocratic, when their leaders lose, then the other side will become undemocratic, and they might be vulnerable to certain actions at that later point in time. So his argument then is that there's an equilibrium for maintaining democracy. Basically, citizens punish elites, even co-partisan elites, who transgress, but they do so only because they anticipate that the other side is going to do the same. So as soon as they no longer anticipate the other side doing the same, they might no longer do so, right? They'd rather have an authoritarian on their side than an authoritarian on the other side. So it's this equilibrium that depends on the anticipation of what the other side might do. At the turn of the century, it's very interesting in this Weingast paper that I just discussed. It's a general theory. It's not about the US specifically. He has one quote about the current state of American democracy in 1997 when it was published, and it was in a footnote. And he says, the US Constitution has provided binding in practice, partly because citizens are willing to defend it by reacting against proposed violation. Anticipating that reaction, political leaders rarely attempt violations. Citizens' reaction implies the US constitutional restrictions on elected officials are self-enforcing. So he has that footnote and enough said. So if we fast forward again to today, and we kind of look at the Brightline Watch, which I'm assuming many of you are familiar with, which is an ongoing survey looking at various democratic outcomes. And we see a quote from their November 2021 report. It's very different than Weingast's perspective, right? Support for co-partisans taking illiberal actions was discouragingly widespread, indicating once again that normative commitments described are not always upheld in practice. So we have this very different picture. Let me turn to partisan violence now. So by partisan violence, I'm going to define it as partisans endorsing physically threatening or harming of opponents. And of course, the concern is not only the actual violence that we might see, but also the normalization of violence. That is, the actual number or percentage of people who might actually take violent actions may be very small, but as it becomes normalized, as more and more people see this as a viable political expression, then it becomes a legitimate way to resolve conflict. That is, we typically think about government as a way to resolve conflict and government interactions, but if violence becomes one of those normalized ways of doing so, this can become obviously very problematic for democratic functioning. So how should we theorize about partisan violence? And it turns out that the theory, while the terminology is a little bit different, it ends up looking very much like the Weingast theory. And this is a theory that was put forth in a paper that I was a part of with Joe Mernick, Sophia Pink, and Rob Wheeler. And we basically conceive of partisan violence as a security threat. That is, individuals support violence preemptively due to threat from the other side. And that's a pretty well-established axiom of sorts, that people typically are engaging in defensive, not offensive violence. So in other words, they support violence as a form of protection. So that leads fairly straightforwardly to an equilibrium for nonviolence, where citizens are not violent because they anticipate that the other side is not going to act violently. Or put another way, citizens do not anticipate the other side to act violently. And this is, the insight is not particularly novel per se, right? If you can go back to comparative politics literature, there's work by a book by Diamond, Lipson, and Lintz, and they basically, in so many words, come to the same point that violence will be less likely when a measure of trust exists between opposing social and political groups. And so it's kind of that same dynamic of anticipation of what the other side is going to do becomes a very salient perspective on whether you get nonviolence, just like whether you get support for democratic norms. Again, looking at the Brightline Watch, what they find in the same survey that I talked about earlier is that there isn't very high levels of support for partisan violence, but nonetheless, they say these findings are in some way reassuring, but it is important to note that they do not mean the risk of political violence is minimal. And again, I think the larger concern is the extent to which violence becomes very normalizing and what consequences that might bring. So to kind of summarize where I am and then kind of get into the study that I'm actually going to present, we have sorting and various other factors that have led to this increased animosity. This animosity has been a contributor to worry about anti-democratic attitudes and partisan violence. And anti-democratic attitudes and partisan violence depend, at least in part, on the belief of what the other side might do. So that coheres very nicely with what has been studied for some time, mostly in psychology, called metaperceptions. And very roughly speaking, this is not technically accurate for any psychologists who are listening, but roughly speaking, how I'm going to treat it is what metaperception is what one believes the other side believes. And so assume that you're a Republican for a moment. So an anti-democratic metaperception would be a question such as, I'm a Republican, and I would be asked, what would an average Democrat support significantly reinterpreting the Constitution in order to block Republican policies? So it's asking me what I think an average person from the other side will do. Or for violence, how do you think an average Democrat would respond to the following question? How much do you feel is justified for Democrats to use violence in advancing their goals these days? So again, it's what I think the other side is going to do. And there's been a developed fairly large set of papers now that show that there's a pretty strong correlation between these meta-perceptions and your own beliefs. And so if I believe the other side is going to be anti-democratic, my endorsement of anti-democratic actions increases, and the same for partisan violence. So this empirical evidence is consistent with the theories that I put forth earlier. The big problem here is if people had accurate meta-perceptions, it might not be it could be problematic, but it might not be horribly problematic because people would be acting kind of as the theories predicate, they'd be acting in ways that are somewhat reasonable, right? They're anticipating the other side might do something problematic, and so they want to act first. But it becomes much more problematic if we have exaggerated meta-perceptions, and we have reasons to think that people might, right? So very basic social identity theory suggests that people like to attribute malicious motivations to people from a different group in order to build up their own group self-esteem. And then, of course, there's a large body of work that on part of political misperceptions that people tend to view rival partisans as more extreme than they actually are, stemming in part from the media environment, perhaps, or media focus on extreme events or conflict and polarization itself. So just to give you one example of this from a paper I was a part of, this is just not about anything I've talked about so far. This is just perceptions of ideology. And so if you just focus on the last two bars, this is the question here was the extent to which partisans believe members of the other party are extreme ideologues. And so here you see 69% of partisans thought, or 69% of partisans thought members of the other parties had extreme ideologies, kind of the end of the scale ideologies, when in reality, it's actually just 38%. So we see this pretty large extent of misperceptions. And there, again, there's a number of papers now showing that there are misperceptions across a large number of different measures. And I'm going to show you some of this in a bit. So if people have these exaggerated meta-perceptions, and that's leading them to have these problematic attitudes, it seems like we have a pretty straightforward way to fix things, right? And that would just be a correction. If provided with accurate information about what the opposing partisans believe, it should reduce the correlation with misperceptions and reduce the levels, right? So if I'm very anti-democratic because I think the other side is very anti-democratic, but then I learn the other side isn't actually very anti-democratic, then I should become less anti-democratic. And so these ideas of corrections have become very, very popular in terms of people thinking that this could be a very good solution in terms of building more support for democracy, lower support for partisan violence. So here are just two quotes. One is that this intervention that holds particular promise for ameliorating political sectarianism. This is a quote from a paper that looked at corrections and found that they were successful in 25 out of 26 countries. Looking at outcomes not too dissimilar from what I'm talking about. And they go so far, this is the last sentence of their paper, reducing that belief has potential to increase social cohesion and well-being of populations around the world. So a lot of celebration of these corrections. And so I realize I'm talking to a misinformation group of people who have studied this a lot. And so I will point out as an aside that yes, it is very interesting that there's all this celebration around correction when we have this very large literature on misinformation and corrections that is much more mixed in the efficacy of these corrections. And for reasons that I'm not quite sure, this literature has not really engaged that literature. But as you will see, I think that's part of the problem. So I thought I'd point that out because I assume that some in the audience are probably wondering about that right about now. So to give you an example of how this correction might work, kind of bracketing the point I just made. So this is from that same paper that I mentioned before, where we implemented one of these corrections for partisan violence. So that the x-axis here is you can just think of it basically as the extent to which you exaggerate the amount of support for partisan violence the other side has, and the y-axis is your own support for partisan violence. And so what the red line is just the typical relationship for between meta-perceptions and support for partisan violence. And as I mentioned, it's a fairly strong correlation. So the more you think the other side is violent, the more violent, supportive of violence you could become. The blue line is when we told people the extent to which the other side actually supports violence, which is much lower than they thought. And you can see that relationship disappeared and average support for violence decreased. Okay, so the question then is, can corrections contribute to democratic stability? Are they as great as some of these quotes that I just put up suggest? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to present this in kind of an awkward fashion in a way, but I think it works more presentationally. I'm going to turn to this experiment I did. And basically, let me tell you a little bit about the experiment and then kind of parts of the experiment and kind of a little bit of theory that I'm going to interject in the process. So the sample was about 1,400 partisans from a quota match sample. And the survey sequence was as follows. First, people answered demographics and political variables and various other meta-perception variables. Then they were asked their anti-democratic meta-perceptions, followed by their anti-democratic attitudes. Then there was a little bit of a break. They did a different exercise. Then they did partisan violence meta-perceptions, and then they did partisan violence attitudes. And there were various embedded attention checks throughout. And so there are 4 conditions. So one was a control condition, where I'm just looking at the relationship between meta-perceptions and your own attitudes. Then there was the correction, which was basically along the lines of the many papers that I've talked about before. And typically in these papers, and as I'll show you in this experiment, the corrections come in the way of saying, what do you think the other side thinks? So how violent do you think the other side might be? And then they give you an answer. And then you correct it by saying, actually, there was a survey done that shows that they are actually this supportive of violence, which is usually much lower than people thought. And so the correction I used was from a survey that I actually did a couple months prior to this experiment. Then there are 2 other conditions. I'm going to come back to these 2 other conditions. This is why it's a little bit of an awkward presentation. I'm going to present part of the experiment, and then I'm going to introduce some other thoughts, and then I'm going to present the rest of the experiment. But this is all random assigned between these 4 different conditions. So for anti-democratic attitudes, I just took a scale, which I think is nice because it encompasses the 3 dimensions of anti-democratic norms that I talked about earlier. It's from a paper by Braley et al., which I think is close to forthcoming. And so I won't go through all of these items, but basically they're items that, for example, if you're a Democrat, they would ask, would you support banning far-right group rallies in the state capitol? Would you support ignoring controversial rulings by Republican judges? Would you support freezing the social media accounts of Republican journalists, and so on and so forth? And so there's 7 of these items. For support for partisan violence, I used a version of the Calma and Mason scale, which is 4 items, although I did it on a 100-point scale, so it's a little bit more of a symmetric scale. So for example, when if ever, if I'm a Democrat again, when if ever is it okay for Republicans or for Democrats to send threatening and intimidating messages to Republican Party leaders? When if ever is it okay for an ordinary Democrat in the public to harass an ordinary Republican on the internet in a way that makes them that makes the target feel frightened? And then there's 2 other measures as well. Okay, so let me talk about the 2 conditions I'm going to focus on at first. So for the control group, I basically asked them these questions. Before I asked them their own attitudes, I said, here are your answers. And I did this simply because I wanted to match it up with what I'm going to show you for the treatment question. So basically, they got a table that said, here are the questions you just answered. This would tell them what their answers were, and then it would give them an average support for what they thought the other side, how violent the other side would be. And then they were kind of told at the bottom, again, this is your average support. For the treatment condition, this is going to look like a lot to process. It looked a lot better in the survey. It was just hard to put it on a slide in a way that made it look, without going through many slides, that made it as intelligible. But basically what they were told was, you just answered these questions. We also asked these same questions of a nationally representative sample of people from the other party, which I had actually done. And then I'm going to give you this table, and the table is going to give you each of the questions. It's going to give you your answer, and then it's going to give you the actual answer. So for example, a lot of people may have guessed, for example, that average, if I'm a Republican, the average Democratic saying that it was okay to send threatening message was maybe at on a 100-point scale, maybe at 40. And then they're showing in the last column that it's actually at 14. And so they're showing all this, and then at the bottom, they're given their average. So for example, average support that they thought the other party might have might be at 45, and then they're told it's actually at 13. So this is a very typical way of correction in these types of experiments. So let me show you the results from these two conditions. First, let me show you the exaggerated meta-perception. So as I suggested before, people tend to exaggerate these. So on the left side is the anti-democratic attitudes. I'm grouping parties here. There were not substantial partisan differences in these outcomes. And so basically the average anti-democratic attitude, again, on a 0 to 100 scale, I took an average across those items. They scaled quite well, was about 28. But people thought the average of the other party would be about 58. So it's about a 30 percentage point jump in terms of their misperception. For violence, the average was about a 15, but the perception of what the other side thought was about a 44. So again, we see about a 30 percentage point meta-perception. And so that's kind of consistent with what I talked about before. So the correction, again, is going to be basically telling people, well, for the average person, well, you just thought it was a 58. It's actually a 27.86. And so what happens here is, as with the other work, right, this is the anti-democratic averages. So this is just the no correction and the correction means. In the no correction condition, they show, as I already showed you, the average was 28, about 27.86 for their anti-democratic attitudes. And the correction, it drops down to about 18. So we see a significant drop in anti-democratic attitudes, consistent with that correction idea. We can see that also flatten the slope, which is kind of what I showed you before in the graphs from the older paper. Right, in the no correction condition, we see this relationship. In the correction condition, that relationship becomes significantly smaller. If we turn to violence, we see very similar things. Right, the average violence score is about 15 without a correction. It drops to about 9 with a correction, which is a significant drop. And we see a significant drop in the slope in terms of the relationship between the meta-perception and support for partisan violence. Okay, so far I haven't told you anything that that kind of original insofar as I've basically replicated or at least conceptually replicated prior work, which has really become quite a number of papers along these lines. So before I go to the next slide, this is where this is a long lead up, but I think this is where it gets a little bit more interesting in terms of thinking about these misperceptions and how robust are these types of corrections. And my thinking here was, this doesn't seem as magical or as much of a silver bullet as a lot of people were saying. And a part of that was thinking that in politics, people don't typically just get a single correction from a presumably credible source and kind of update accordingly with no political competition. And so my interest was in what happens when you introduce a little bit of competition. So for example, the other side suddenly saying like, no, actually, they aren't that democratic, or no, they aren't that opposed to violence. And I'm going to look at two different manifestations of that type of competition. One is the introduction of scientific uncertainty. Right, in essence, a correction is a piece of scientific information. It's a piece of data from a poll. And the idea is that it's meant to sway one's view, and that can have an effect. But we also know that there is a lot of evidence concerning the politicization of science. And by that, let me be very clear, because that term is used in a lot of different ways. I'm going to use this not in terms of pursuing a partisan agenda per se, but rather kind of in a way that was used by Oreskes and Conway in their book, Merchants of Doubt, and when an actor emphasizes the inherent uncertainty of science by casting doubt upon it, which is, it's very easy to do because science always has uncertainty behind it. So the idea here is you politicize it by pointing out that there's a lot of uncertainty. And this is a very common tactic of climate denialism. This is kind of been systematically pursued by climate denial organizations. What happens here is the uncertainty can generate anxiety, and that anxiety often leads to a preference for the status quo or risk aversion. So they dismiss the evidence. And so the idea, again, is that elites have an incentive to exploit that uncertainty if it doesn't benefit them. And I had seen in some other work kind of on climate change attitudes and other scientific domains that when presented with uncertainty about different evidence, people do tend to dismiss it. So the curiosity or the prediction here was, as soon as you introduce uncertainty about this correction, people are no longer going to follow the correction. The other type of information that could cause a problem for corrections is that there could be counterframing. by the opposing party, right? Usually you don't just get one side of things. And of course, elites have an incentive to reframe the other side as extreme, as problematic. And so you're going to see these kinds of counterframing. And, this is, I just put in this quote because this is a quote from Riker going back where he was talking about a lot of psychology, actually prospect theory experiments, where he was complaining about kind of the same dynamic, that you're not getting kind of this dueling messages. And I had also seen in other work I'd done kind of on other things that when people are presented with equally strong dueling types of frames or informations, people tend to revert back to their prior beliefs, or in other words, they will not update according to the new information they added because they're not sure what to do. And moreover, if one of those pieces of information coheres with their prior beliefs, they're even more likely to follow that, which makes the correction even more tenuous potentially. So let me come back to the design. You might recall that I said I had these two other conditions. Now you know why I had these two other conditions. These two other conditions were basically the treatment correction, exactly as I had already presented it, but they introduced either pole uncertainty or a competing pole. So let me show you an example of the pole uncertainty. So after the correction, people were then told, recall the actual average partisan score comes from a survey we conducted with a nationally representative sample of people from that party. That said, interpreting any survey or poll can be tricky and possibly unreliable, as was made clear by the 2020 presidential election polls. Indeed, a report from the American Association for Public Opinion Research states the average performance of polls in 2020 was amongst the worst in recent memory. And they had a link to that report if they wanted to look at it. It's an actual quote from the report. For competition for the anti-democratic outcome, they were told some point to other surveys that offer a different picture. For example, an experimental survey by Yale political scientists looked at whether Democrats, this is for Republicans, looked at whether Democrats would vote for a Democratic candidate who took anti-democratic positions. The survey showed that more than 90% of Democratic voters continued to support the candidate even after the candidate violated democratic principles. The authors conclude that only a fraction choose democracy over partisan loyalty. And again, they could have followed a link to the actual APSR article by Graham and Slovit. And so for violence, I'll just give you one example because this varied across partisanship. But for Republicans, they were told some may point to other surveys that offer a different picture. For example, while not explicitly about violence, a morning consult poll nonetheless showed that nearly 70% of Democrats expressed support for protests against police sparked by the death of George Floyd in June 2020. And then not surprisingly for Democrats, they were told about support for not pursuing January 6 cases. All right, so I'm going to put, you just saw a very quick thing of the results. I'm going to basically put up the same results I did before, but I'm going to add in the two conditions that I just told you about. So here are the mean scores for anti-democratic attitudes. You've already seen the first two bars. It was at 28, the correction lowered it. And as you can see, as soon as you introduce that uncertainty or the competition, it goes back up basically to the no correction mean. So in both those cases, it's no longer significantly different from the no correction mean, and it is significantly greater than the correction. So introducing any one of those types of competition, either uncertainty or a competing frame, undermines the efficacy of the correction. If we look at the slopes, we're seeing that it's working through basically reintroducing that connection with meta-perceptions, right? You can see in the no correction condition, we see a pretty a correlation of 0.25. You see that slope there, and that's exactly the same slope that we find in the uncertainty and the competitive frame condition. So unlike the correction condition where that slope became flatter, it doesn't in these other two conditions. When we turn to violence, we see a very similar picture, right? We saw already that the correction lowered it from about 15 to about 9, but as soon as we introduce the uncertainty or the competition, it goes right back up. So for the uncertainty, it goes to 14, and for the competition, it goes to about 13. And so again, it's significantly greater than the correction, and the uncertainty is obviously no different than no correction. The competition is borderline uncertainty. I can talk, or borderline significantly different, but basically in line with the correction. I can talk more about that if anybody has a question in Q&A, why it's not quite as high as it might otherwise be. And again, we see with the slopes, we see the correction slope becomes very much flatter, but as soon as we introduce these competing information, the slopes kind of go back up to what they look like in the no correction condition. So the implications are exaggerated meta-perceptions shape support for violence and anti-democratic attitudes. That's been established. That was established by other people. Other people had also shown that isolated corrections can counteract the effects. But I would say that corrections do not seem so robust to the introduction of uncertainty or competition. And of course, partisan elites have the incentive to paint the other side in unflattering terms, and hence uncertainty and competition likely are fairly common. And it's not hard to think of examples, right? Biden's speech on the Republicans being anti-democratic, coverage of the January 6 hearings, Trump's constant claims of election fraud by Democrats. If you ever watch Fox News, coverage of Democrats and the Antifa riots, and so on and so forth. And this introduces kind of this conundrum insofar as the defining element of democracy, i.e. competition and competing forms of information, are undermining potential efforts to protect democracy. So we have this little bit of a tension that comes up. That may raise the question of, can we turn to other corrections? And I think I'm going to just, watching the time, I'm not going to go into this. I'm going to kind of briefly talk about this, and then I'm going to try to get to my conclusions. So there's a little time for conversation. What I'm about to kind of summarize very briefly comes from a project called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, which was a collaborative project with Rob Willer and Dave Rand. And what we did is we crowdsourced interventions where people could submit different interventions aimed to reduce support for partisan violence or anti-democratic attitudes or partisan animosity. And we chose 25 out of 252 submissions, many of which were about meta-perception corrections. And we tested them in this very large survey experiment with about 32,000 people, and we saw which corrections were most efficacious. I'm not going to go through the results of this because just for time reasons, but I'll just give you a quick summary. Basically, when it comes to the outcomes of anti-democratic attitudes and partisan violence, what we saw were the ones that were most effective were typically ones that were like the ones I just have been talking about. There were corrections of misperceptions, often meta-perception corrections. In fact, the Braley et al. Paper, which I drew the measures from, in which basically my correction was based upon, was the single most best performing intervention in the entire tournament across all of the outcomes. And so that was one approach. And obviously, I've kind of hopefully raised a little bit of questions about that approach. The other approach that seemed to work somewhat for anti-democratic attitudes and partisan violence was when you would get cues from bipartisan messages from people from each of the parties endorsing being anti-violent or being pro-democratic, such as having a peaceful transition of power. So to me, that kind of raises this question of there are these two approaches out there that might be effective. And so I'm going to kind of turn to a conversation of that and skip over these slides. Let me just first start by talking about some of the concerns I have and then some of the solutions based on what I kind of just intimated about. So basically, the concern is that misperceptions undermine coordination. If you go back to the theoretical work I talked about before, and corrections seem to be very difficult in democracy due to this information competition. Now, we could think about trust in elites and these ideas of cues that I raised before. Of course, that if we just trust in terms of kind of trusting people from either party, it's become very partisan, and so it's hard to have accountability for one party or another. So we really need this bipartisan endorsements, which might be hard to come by. So that raises a few questions. What are the solutions to kind of this ostensible increase in anti-democratic attitudes and possible increase in support for partisan violence? Well, one point to make is that most Americans do not act based on these attitudes. So we need to also, in terms of kind of future work, think about what is the relationship between these attitudes and actual behaviors, and particularly voting per se. There's also the question of can we rely on elites who share values of democracy? I'm going to come back to this question. And let me just say, this is coming back to the mega study tournament that I just spoke about. The most effective elite Q interventions, so there was the effective meta-perception intervention. The most effective elite Q intervention was basically two candidates who were running for the governor of Utah, and they had come together to do a commercial where they said that they would both respect the outcome of the election and how important it is for people from both parties to respect democracy. And that seemed to have a very good effect in terms of getting people to be less anti-democratic and less supportive of partisan violence. So this raises an interesting question, again, that I'm going to come back to in a moment. One other solution, though, would be thinking about pluralism and checks and balances as safeguards, but also hurdles. So this is an interest, coming back to where I started, right? I talked about pluralism and checks and balances as safeguards to American democracy. And that's an interesting question because there's been this very long-standing debate about the necessity of both pluralism and checks and balances, right? So here's a quote from that same Schatz-Schneider book I quoted at the beginning. If the multiplicity of interest in a large republic makes tyrannical majorities impossible, the principal theoretical prop of the separation of powers has been demolished. It's a basic point here is that some theorists have often said, we don't need both checks, right? We don't need pluralism and checks and balances. And what checks and balances do is that they create a lot of gridlock. And then, I think the most recent incarnation of this kind of argument was a 2003 book that Sam Cornell edited about kind of the thinking of James Madison, where he makes a similar argument that basically the separation of powers is creating this gridlock and we can't get anything done. So I think it's an interesting point insofar as it kind of raises the question of, given the sorting that I talked about before, and given some of the actions that we've seen taking place, maybe there is an upside to having these multiple checks or multiple ways to contain American democracy, insofar as legal checks can constrain some extreme actions. And so, for example, we've seen courts do this in some cases. Of course, the main downside, though, is because we have so many checks, aside from the typical gridlock we get, it also makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to formalize a lot of the norms and ideals that we think are important to democracy. So on the one hand, you have these checks and balances, which might be useful to protect against extreme action, but those same checks and balances also are going to make it very hard to codify legally some of the norms that we probably wish the founders would have codified originally. So that's a downside of that. And so I think I have no solution. I think it raises some interesting questions about the thinking about American democracy. And along those lines, so I'm just going to end with kind of, I said I was going to end not with a conclusion, but with some questions. And one big question I think is, does democracy depend on parties and partisans' moral commitment to democracy? And I'm kind of getting at here, does it depend on elites from two parties, as in the Utah commercial that I talked about before, coming together and say, we're morally committed to democracy and we should follow it? Does it depend on that? Or is there a tipping point where competition and power seems to trump values? Do we depend on that kind of commitment? Or is it entirely dependent on a self-enforcing equilibrium from self-interested actors, right? The theories that I put forth before, when thinking about anti-democratic action and partisan violence, we're portraying people as very self-interested. And in that conception, there's more to worry about, insofar as if we move off the focal points where we're at this equilibrium of stability, we might kind of unravel into having a lot of instability. And so the relative impact or importance of these commitments versus self-interest, I think, is an important question to think about. And then if shared values are lacking, the question becomes, how far can legal bounds be enforced, and do checks and balances work in the absence of pluralism? So put another way, is if it isn't really a moral commitment, and we have these self-interested actors, just how strong are the legal bounds that we have, and how much will they be enforced? And I think that's a question that a lot of us are asking right about now, and I'm kind of just putting it that way. And then I think as an aside, it's not on the slide, but an aside is kind of, is there a skew towards the different types of institutions that are enforcing these? So for example, right, in terms of voting rights acts, things that are codified are asymmetrically favorable to Republicans, and so therefore, they might protect against certain abuses, but they're going to protect in a certain asymmetrical way. And so that's something to think about in terms of the kind of the direction of the protections of the institutions that we do have. And then, of course, there's the larger question of just how endogenous these political institutions are, and how much can political actors come in and kind of start to change these political institutions. And this is kind of getting at some of the questions that we might see the Supreme Court ruling on in terms of state power, in terms of elections, and so on and so forth. And so I think that, thinking about this, where I kind of end is, there are a lot of celebration and kind of like, oh, if we can just correct these meta perceptions, this would increase the stability of democracy. I'm much less sanguine about that. I think that when thinking about these questions, it's very hard to divorce the behavior from the institutions. And so we need to kind of think about the role of these institutions in kind of conditioning behavior and kind of the extent to which they protect about different types of extreme behaviors. And so I will end with that and open it up to any questions that people might have. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So I would encourage audience members to put any questions you have in the Q&A box. But in the absence of anything there at the moment, I'll go ahead and take the host prerogative and ask the first question. Actually, starting with a small question, I'm curious whether the patterns you saw with and without treatment were symmetrical across ideologies, or if not, how might they have been asymmetrical? Well, okay, why don't you let you answer that, and then I have other questions. But
yeah, so it's a really interesting question, actually. So and I don't know exactly what's going on here. So basically, the means were largely symmetrical. in terms of kind of the overall means. So, right, the argument was that the meta perceptions would no longer have a correlation when there's a correction, and they would have a correlation when there is a correction. And so the overall outcomes were pretty much the same for Democrats and Republicans, but that mechanism did not seem to be the same insofar as Republicans, the correction itself, in fact, was not working to kind of sever ties with the meta perception amongst Republicans. Their mean score dropped down due to the corrections, but the relationship with the meta perception, the slope didn't decrease. So I don't know, there's some kind of different mechanism going on in terms of how they're thinking about the correction. And I'm not kind of sure exactly what's going on there.
Okay.
Not entirely symmetrical.
The other question I wanted to ask concerned the speculations toward the end, because it seems to me that the checks and balances logic assumes cross-cutting cleavages across the institutions. They're only going to check each other if they have cross-cutting interests. So it's all, and I think you might have been alluding to this toward the end. The extent to which the courts are going to serve as that check is going to depend on the extent to which the courts are not necessarily aligned with the other institutions. So I'm really just sort of throwing this back here. Is that really an upside, or is that just this, it's a kind of like, the post-World War II bipartisan consensus, an artifact of another time that's not necessarily going to save us.
Yeah, I guess I think that's kind of one of the pressing questions, which I don't have an answer to, because I think it's hard to know the inclinations of the courts writ large. But I guess my point is to basically arrive at the same question that you're having, which is what exactly, how much of a safeguard can the courts be, and kind of, who is kind of overseeing the court's behaviors? How much are upper courts going to keep lower courts in line, right? Because we've seen so many cases now where lower courts have made somewhat lawless type decisions, and then we have to kind of wait for the appeals process to go in. And so are the courts going to be sufficient to serve as a protective check or not? I think is a big, I'm not necessarily super optimistic about that, but I think that's kind of one of the main questions right now, especially
in a world where the parties are desperately trying to politicize the courts. They're throwing everything they've got at it.
Right.
Okay,
and so I think you could also kind of then take the points that I was making before, and you can almost stick it in like, do justices have a moral commitment to a rule of law? And obviously a lot of them do not. I don't know, I'm not a judicial expert, so I don't really know how it goes, but we're all paying a lot more attention to the courts right now than we had in a very long time, for a reason, I think.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question from the audience. Can you speak more to the role of mis and disinformation in stoking partisanship and polarization? Does this impact both parties the same way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we talk about kind of the evolution of animosity, and then kind of subsequently the anti-democratic attitudes and support for partisan violence, elites definitely have a role to play in that. I think that's fairly well established if we kind of look from the turn of the century, starting kind of in the 1990s, particularly starting with Gingrich, and the kind of change in partisan rhetoric and the increase in the partisan nature of rhetoric and the incivility of rhetoric. We've definitely seen that playing a role in the rise of animosity. There's certainly evidence of that. I think there's studies out there showing that kind of exposure to elite anti-democratic rhetoric can also lead to more anti-democratic attitudes. So I think it plays a role. I don't know the extent to which it is the defining role. I think there are lots of different levers that have led to these types of trends. I don't know. I don't know if I'd be comfortable saying elites have played the primary role in stoking this or not. I think they've certainly played a role. The impact on other parties is a really interesting question, and I think my answer is that they probably have not. acted in the same way. And the reason for that, it's a very debated question, right? This question of if there's kind of asymmetry or symmetry in terms of how people from different ideologies or different partisans process information is, a pretty contested debate. And, as far as I can tell, my reading of the evidence is what you see is that Republicans or conservatives more specifically tend to be less open to new information. They tend to kind of like structure and order. And so they're going to not expose themselves to as much kind of varied information as Democrats might. Whereas Democrats or liberals, I should really be saying liberals and conservatives, because I think most of the compelling evidence is looking at ideology. Liberals are usually open to more information, and so they're going to expose themselves to a more varied amount of information. So I think that parties are not reacting in the same way. I think then kind of tracking that out into how that kind of impacts their attitudes is not as clear to me. And so I think that's actually a question that needs to be kind of explored more clearly. But in terms of the trends that I just talked about, just to give you an example, so if you look at kind of Twitter data, what you see is, for example, you see liberals are much more likely to engage Republican members of Congress or talk about Republican issues than Democrats or than conservatives are to engage Democratic members of Congress and talk about liberal issues. How that then plays out in terms of these attitudes is a great question, and just something I need to think through a little bit more.
Okay, another question from the audience. If affective polarization is an instance of intergroup prejudice, do you think short informational interventions are destined to be minimally effective, just as we would expect from other efforts to reduce prejudice in society?
Yeah, thanks for coming, Seth. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's a hard question for me because I guess my short answer is not particularly. So I'm going to give a two-stage answer. I don't think these short interventions are really a very good solution in terms of ultimately addressing these problems. And I think if you look at a lot of these interventions as tested, they don't endure. So even things like studies that look at like military integration, military sex integration, right? You see like an increase in gender equity attitudes amongst integrated units, but they kind of dissipate 6 months later. So I think these kind of interventions often don't last very long. That said, I do think scholarship looking at how these different interventions might work is a very worthwhile route of scholarship insofar as that can provide insight into what kinds of more structural or deeper changes might be useful in pursuing. So for example, just work on contact. If we had a better grasp of the conditions under which contact was effective and we could track that out to policy beliefs, that could then have institutional implications in terms of how we structure different types of activities, educational activities, and so on, kind of scaling up. So I think these interventions are worth studying. There needs to be more attention to how to scale these interventions up when we do study them. So that's kind of my kind of middle of the road answer, I guess.
Okay, another question. Well, how does political polarization contribute to violence against women politicians? Are there any empirical studies that show women politicians experience more violence than the politicians of other gender identities?
Yeah, that's a great question. There actually, I just came across a study on this yesterday or the day before in the journal of Groups, Identity, and Politics. I'm not stating the exact name of the journal correctly, and it did seem to provide some evidence that they were looking, I believe, at mayors, and they were looking at kind of threats made against city mayors, and they did seem to find a gendered component such that people were more likely to make threats against women office holders, women mayors specifically. And I believe they also were looking at people of color, where there was also an increased number of threats. So I think that's a really kind of understudied area of work, insofar as, obviously there's going to be intersection of various different identities and backgrounds that are going to kind of raise or lower the likelihood of violence, especially if we think of violence as preemptive violence. People are threatened by different people more or less, and so I think it's surprising there hasn't been more work on that, but that is the one paper I've seen on it. There may be more, particularly in psychology, away from political violence and just looking at kind of violence more generally, I imagine there's probably a literature on that.
Okay, we have a question from my co-host, Brian Swire-Thompson. Brian, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks so much. It was incredibly interesting and definitely right up my alley, given all the correction work. I was wondering whether you had a hunch for like what the underlying mechanisms are like for these reduction in anti-democratic attitudes. Are they just that people are seeing it like a less antagonistic political environment, or?
Yeah, I mean, my hunch is that they're seeing that it's one of two things, and I'm not sure which. Like coming back to Matt's initial question, I think some of it is they're seeing, well, the other side isn't going to do something anti-democratic, and so I don't really have to worry about them kind of taking away what I think is right, or my democratic rights, and so I probably don't have to take that action. I think another mechanism, though, which would have quite different implications, would be that there might just be some kind of a normative kind of message being sent, being told like, oh, okay, the norm in this case is to kind of not have these attitudes, in which case those measures are kind of a little bit less reassuring than they might otherwise be if kind of it's a normative process. And so I haven't seen people really study in this domain, study the mechanisms particularly well, and so I think it would be good to know what's going on there. Kind of like what I said to Matt, that mechanism, the meta-perception reduction mechanism, did not seem to work for Republicans. So maybe it was a normative mechanism. I'm not sure.
Oh, that's so cool. Thank you. Also, a very quick follow-up. Do you know if these last at all? If they have lasting effects over time?
The corrections themselves? Yeah. So I know of two studies that have looked over time. One was the study that I was a part of, the one that I showed you some evidence for. We did find that it lasted for 4 weeks later. But I'd be a little cautious about that. We did that study during a pretty politically quiet time, like it was not near an election. It wasn't, no major political events occurred during that month, and so I don't know if that played some role in it. The other study that I've seen looked at durability is this the outcome variables, the extent to which you support obstruction of obfuscating the other side or obstructing them. And in that case, the correction did not last. I think they were also looking at 4 weeks. And so, it's kind of, there might be other studies, but the two ones I know have two different conclusions.
Amazing. Thank you. So interesting.
And that one is the Lees and Sakara study, which you probably know of. That was in Nature Human Behavior.
Okay, we have another question. I'm watching from Brazil. Here we are having a huge polarization in politics. In this context, the actual president is questioning institutions, the voting process. What could be done to reaffirm democracy when persons with public roles are questioning law and forcing their followers to do the same? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And it really gets to kind of some of the conversations that I think are important to be having. And I think it comes back to kind of thinking about the kind of a local level, and kind of the extent to which local politics can somehow reaffirm democratic processes, which is a tricky issue. And I think that might apply to Brazil even more so than the United States, insofar as the strength of federalism in Brazil, as far as I understand it. And so it's tricky insofar as you could see some kind of more democratic affirmation at the local level, or democratic socialization at the local level, kind of like the Utah commercial that I described before. And so that could be a very good thing. But the flip side of that is kind of along the lines of the 2022 midterms that we just saw, right? And people felt very reassured that a lot of the election deniers did not win. Not covered nearly as much was that most of the election deniers did win. They just happened to win in completely red states. And so, at that point in the local level, you're not doing very much for democracy. And so that's not a very uplifting answer either. But I do think part of the answer is kind of to the denationalization of politics a little bit, as kind of the nationalization of politics. And kind of as that becomes more prevalent and everything becomes more politicized, and we move away from local issues, I think two things happen. One thing is people start to feed into the national level debates, and when they become anti-democratic, they feed into that. And the other is problems or issues in people's lives become more distant. And the more personalized and kind of closer, if you just think of construal theory, problems and issues are to you, the less likely you are to follow kind of a partisan bent. And so I think somehow kind of reaffirming kind of the place of local politics and the place of local news can be somewhat helpful. And I think a lesson from COVID, for example, to the extent that was nationalized, it was fairly disastrous. But if you look at locations where people felt severe threat, they acted with a little bit more rationality than they might otherwise would have. So that's kind of the best I can do without being too pessimistic.
Well, on that uplifting note, we've hit the 1 o'clock hour, so I think we're gonna unfortunately have to leave it there. So let's all thank Professor Jamie Druckman for a stimulating, if not necessarily entirely uplifting talk. Many thanks, and we'll see you all in the new year. We'll be back with another set of speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great questions.
Bye.